Hi, and thank you for tuning into Noire Histoire. I'm Natasha, and in this episode, I'll be discussing Song Yet Sung. Song Yet Sung by James McBride is in part a story about the Underground Railroad, but it's also about much more. The story takes place in 1850, about a decade before the start of the Civil War, and follows a young woman, Liz Spocott, who has escaped from the plantation where she grew up. Liz is described as being beautiful, which has unfortunately attracted the attention of the slave master. Not exactly seeking freedom, but rather just to get away from him, she runs away. It turns out that Liz has dreams and visions which enable her to see far into the future. What follows is a thrilling chase and scavenger hunt of sorts as Liz seeks to understand the code of the Underground Railroad in hopes of escaping the pursuing bounty hunters. The man that owns Liz is rather wealthy, or at least he's financially comfortable. And so with that, he sends slave catchers and later a bounty hunter to track her down. While fleeing the first group of paddy rollers and general slave catchers, she's shot in the head, but rescued by a young black man, Little George. He saves her from the individuals who are pursuing her, but really it's because he has his own plans for her. Turns out that Little George is the slave of a vicious woman, Patty Cannon, who leads a posse of slave traders. While Liz is saved from immediate danger by Little George, she has also in a sense been captured by him. The gunshot wound doesn't kill Liz, but it's still a serious injury as for the potential of infection. She's placed in an attic to recuperate, and it takes quite a few days, but eventually the bullet kind of works its way out, and with that she survives a very close brush with death. Upon coming to, she finds that she's actually in an attic above an inn where several other black people are being held. Patty is notorious for kidnapping and selling black people south, whether they're free or enslaved. When the opportunity presents itself, her and her group will capture people and sell them further south where they can get more money for the sale. This woman is dangerous. She's very feared in the area. She carries a gun and is out here looking rough and rugged. Granted, this is the antebellum South, where it's at this time, granted, it's a work of fiction. But keeping in mind that at this time in the South, a lot of Southern women would have been sticking more close to home. They wouldn't have been living this kind of rough and tumble life where basically Patty's a paddy roller. It wasn't a profession that a lot of women at the time would have gone into. And so here it is that you have this woman operating as a slave catcher, a slave stealer as well, carrying guns, carrying on and whatnot. And so the interesting thing is that this is certainly a work of fiction, but Liz, in part, her character comes to be known as the dreamer after she regains consciousness and whatnot. And so in the attic, she realizes that she's not by herself. She's actually being kept with several other enslaved people. Well, some enslaved, some free, but people under the control of Patty Cannon and her crew. And so Liz is identified as being special by an older woman that's part of the group. In fact, they've been waiting for her. They've been waiting for a sign, and they see Liz as being that sign. Delirious from the shot to her head, or at least in part, Liz speaks aloud about visions and dreams. And they're shared with us as the audience, but pretty much it's visions of the future. So this is 1850. And what she's seeing, these visions are well over 100 years in the future. So 1960s onwards, right? The 50s, the 60s, and even extending closer to the present day for us. So it's if you imagine a Connecticut Yankee in King Arthur's court, this theme of being from the present and going into the past. But in this case, it's turned on its head where she doesn't time travel or anything like that. But as a person of the past, she has the ability to see into the future. She has visions, right? And shares them with some of the black people that she comes into contact with. And so with that, they're amazed because the visions that she's sharing are so outside the norm that they're almost unbelievable. But yet it leaves them in awe. And so with that, they have been waiting for a sign, a symbol that someone's going to be able to help them to get out of this situation in the attic, to help them find a way, if not to freedom, then at least to escape their current state of bondage. Comes into play this discussion of code, which is a series of signals, songs, symbols, secret phrases, things along those lines that when woven together, chart a path that would enable an individual to escape to freedom, to escape to the north. If you think of the Underground Railroad, where quite often the way that it's described is you just run north. But that's not really how it worked. You would have conductors and stations along the way. The conductors were people who would help you along the way. The stations could be houses, churches, other structures, places and things that served as havens to stop and rest, or hideouts that you could use to enable danger to pass. Song Yet Sung takes place in eastern Maryland. Being up in the north was something else, but being down in the south or in some of these like border states, as in this case, was different. People being willing to help escape slaves to help like runaway slaves get to freedom, but at the same time trying to preserve their own safety. And as part of that, their lives and the lives of their family, their loved ones, and also the ability to continue to help others. So with that, they couldn't just like hang a shingle out front, telling the world that they were conductors on the Underground Railroad. And so as part of that, you had this code that would be used to suss out who was part of this unofficial network. And part of that is knowing like little bits and pieces of code to help you as a passenger along the way, to help you figure out who's an ally versus who might be a potential enemy or liability. And so as Liz comes to in this room, the older woman begins to share this code with her in exchange for her sharing her visions. This is the eastern shore of Maryland, a border state where there's slavery. You have landowning classes, people where they're a bit wealthier, they own slaves. But you also have, because this is like on the shore where there's a lot of water, you have watermen. These are individuals who live out on the water. They're not necessarily farmers, though some might be. And generally they're like either solo or two-man operations, earning a living, supporting themselves and their families through the catching and selling of oysters. And so you have this division within, and this is for the white community. You have this division within the white community where for the land-owning class, they're more likely to own slaves. They're wealthier. They're a bit more gung-ho about the preservation of slavery. And then you have this other class, the oystermen, which is like, it's something that goes back for several generations at this point, sort of like with the slave-owning class as well, where not to say that they're abolitionists necessarily, but because they don't own slaves, they're not as wedded to the institution. Their major goal is not the preservation of the institution of slavery. That's not to say that they're not like abolitionists or anything like that, but they're somewhere in between. So you have like this unease within the white community where you have the landowners who are wealthy and they throw their weight around. And then you have the oystermen who, a number of them are really just scraping by. The work can be dangerous due to storms, due to just being out on the water. And so there's this tension between these two groups, despite their race. Because here it is that you have this one group that's working very hard. They're having to personally do work. And then you have some of these landowners who are now using their proceeds from other businesses to get into oystering because they're coming in with more money. They're able to buy bigger boats. They're kind of more commercializing the industry, which is kind of squeezing out some of these smaller watermen. And with that, because it's becoming increasingly difficult for them to earn a living, and even those who are successful or whose families have been successful, they're still kind of just making enough money to get by. They're not really getting rich or wealthy off of this unless they've had to start somewhere else. And so as part of that, where this has been like a generational thing for quite some time, where fathers would pass on this profession to their sons, you now have this thing where it's becoming more difficult to earn a living this way. There are now other options, such as being a slave catcher or a bounty hunter, where you have some individuals who are leaving behind these waterman careers, these traditional family careers, to go where the money is. And so with that, you have this character, Denwood Long, who's also known as the Gimp. He comes from a line of oystermen. His father, and likely their ancestors before that, the way that they earned their living was out on the water, catching oysters. But with him wanting more money, and actually kind of being a bit money hungry, or at least wanting a more comfortable life, he leaves oystering, the waterman life, and goes to work as a slave catcher. And with his background as an oysterman, knowing the ways of the water, having an understanding of nature from hunting and being out in the area, these are skills that are actually quite beneficial for him as they allow him to more easily track escaped slaves. But there are events that take place in his life, and he ends up putting that aside for a time. That is until Liz's owner approaches him with the offer of a sizable amount of money, a sizable reward, if he can recapture and return Liz. And so with that, he gets into the fray. But you have this separation where he represents the waterman and in a sense straddles the fence, where he's not exactly pro-slavery, but they're not going all out for slavery, right? He's not like an abolitionist, but he's not pro-slavery either. He straddles the fence. But then you have Patty, who's definitely pro-slavery. She's a landowner. She owns like this inn. And in addition to that, she makes money through the system of slavery. On the other side of this, you then have Black people in the area where they're actually divided over Liz. Especially she gains notoriety for being the so-called dreamer. When an opportunity presents itself, Liz and the rest of the group escape, though their fates from that point forward varies. The escape of these slaves prevents Patty from selling them, which she was counting on as an opportunity to make a sizable amount of money. Patty's not willing to just take that. So her and her crew kind of gather up and whatnot and go in search of Liz and these other slaves. But Liz in particular, because she's regarded as being like the ringleader. Liz comes to be known as the dreamer, and her legend actually spreads throughout the area and produces different reactions within the Black and then also within the white sections of society. You have these two factions of white people that hear this legend, right? The landowners are particularly upset about this because they're looking at it as if there's inklings of this escape, especially with the dreamer as Liz comes to be known, she's regarded as like being an instigator of this escape. There's fear that she might be able to cause an uprising or an insurrection. And so with that, there's this constant discomfort with the idea of the enslaved rising up and running off. And so tensions in the area are mounting. And that also has an effect on the Black community. Certainly there are some free Black people. There are more enslaved Black people as well. But you also have some people who are kind of a bit of both, where they themselves might be free or enslaved, but they might have family members, be that a husband or wife, children, parents, or what have you, where they might be free, but their loved ones might still be in bondage, or vice versa. And so with that, you have different perspectives on the dreamer and freedom itself, where some people, they're kind of in awe of this legend of the dreamer. And then you have others who kind of like poo-poo it, right? They dismiss it because they don't believe that any such person exists. Now, the thing to note is that Liz and this story of the dreamer is actually representative of Harriet Tubman. It's just that like the name is different. And Patty is also actually based on a real person. From my understanding, based on what I read in an interview with the author, Liz the Dreamer is based on Harriet Tubman. Patty is based on a woman of the same name who lived in this area of Maryland. But he takes some creative license here because the two did not live at the same time. They lived in the same area, but not at the same time, and they never had these interactions. Patty was never in pursuit of Harriet Tubman, but under different circumstances. So like, had they lived at the same time, they likely would have crossed paths. They would have been on opposite sides of this debate, in the sense that Patty was a slave stealer and also a bounty hunter. And Harriet Tubman, as we all know, was kind of like the Moses of her time, not just helping herself to escape, but also helping others to escape as well, helping other people escape slavery. And as part of that, had the two been adults at the same time, they likely would have crossed paths, given their activities, given the roles that they played in this history of slavery. The real Patty died in 1829, and I think it's noted that Harriet Tubman was born in like 1820. So Harriet Tubman would have only been about 9 at the time the real Patty died. Patty was indeed a hot flaming mess of a terrible person, and one could only imagine what things might have been like if they truly lived and been of age at the same time. So it gives way to this thing of these two doing battle, right? Liz kind of trying not so much to find freedom, but safety, which is incredibly elusive for her, being enslaved, being a runaway, and then having Patty kind of trying to track her down, to catch her and return her to slavery. So not just to get like the reward, but retribution, revenge for causing her to lose out on the money that she would have made on those other slaves. And Patty tries to pursue them, to recapture some of them. She's able to track down some of them, but given the circumstances of how they come upon each other and interact, some of them end up dying, which is like a loss of money because the value of slaves comes through the buying and selling of them and their work. And so it's like once a slave dies, their body is deemed as not having monetary value beyond that point because you can't get anything from them, right? You can't put them to work or anything like that. And so you have this adventure doesn't seem to be the right word. Journey either. But it's like this kind of cat and mouse game where Liz is trying to stay a step ahead of Patty to remain free, to kind of remain beyond her grasp. But you have Patty at the same time trying to hunt her down, and other people joining the fray. It's like the societal structure at the time, instead of providing protection for Liz, is instead very supportive of the efforts to recapture her, to send her back to bondage. It's like this thing of her and the allies that she meets along the way, like kind of helping her to stay, or try to stay a step ahead of these forces that are trying to force her back into slavery. So there's just like a lot going on. You have slave narratives, and the book borrows from some of those experiences, right? This is one of those books where, unlike others where you read it and kind of make up your own mind about the ideas presented by the author, this is a book with a lot of twists and turns. It's like, imagine if you were reading a first-hand account and through that, like in your mind's eye, visualizing Harriet Tubman trying to escape for the first time. It's kind of like that, where you don't really know what the outcome is going to be, but you're here and you're watching her along, as you know, you're along for the ride. And so the people that she comes into contact with, some of them are allies, some of them are potential threats. And so it leads to the book having quite a bit of suspense. It's a work of historical fiction, so you do have some history here with a telling of not just like slavery or slave narratives, but also a sort of brief history of Maryland's Eastern Shore with regards to watermen, the slaveholding class, these other little moments from history and how society functioned at the time. It's incredibly insightful in that regard. As someone that likes history, that was a major plus for me. And then in addition to that, this thing about like the Underground Railroad Code, how people would signal to each other, pass along information, conductors or stations, the Underground Railroad would be identified, kind of like hidden in plain sight. And you would kind of fit these pieces together to figure things out. I like scavenger hunts. And in a way, reading this book kind of reminded me of that. It's like, if you think of those Dan Brown books, I can remember, I think that's the author's name, right? I can't remember what the character's name was, but he was like some art historian or something, and the books were really popular in the early 2000s. I think Angels and Demons was one of them. Where it's like, there were these big books at the time, there were movies they were terrible, but Tom Hanks starred in them. And it was like, you would get a clue that would then lead you to this next clue. And you find that clue and on and on and on to get from place to place and kind of solve the puzzle or whatever, right? You meet this person, they'll give you information to get you to the next person. So kind of like a scavenger hunt type thing. And I felt it was interesting, right? It was exciting. And then it's like having that combined with history just made it all the more enjoyable for me. But in addition to that, there's also like a love story where Liz, due to slavery, she's just trying to survive. And she's also kind of young. We find out that she's not even really trying to escape, but there are all these expectations being put on her and this kind of legend that's forming around her where she's really just trying to live. She's described as being incredibly beautiful. It's something that's pointed out by several characters. And what you have is this thing of her really just trying to survive. And she doesn't have much ties, as by this time she's in her late teens, early 20s, and her parents had either died or it's not exactly quite, I don't quite remember what happened to them, but she'd been separated from them from a very young age. And she was raised by this man on the plantation, another black enslaved man, who raised her and several other children. He took care of them, showered them with love. But you also have this thing of when the kids would come to a certain age, situations occurred where they might be sold off, something might happen to them, they might run off, whatever, what have you. And so while Liz was growing up, from a very young age, she experienced loss, not really having a traditional family structure. And so as she gets older, she hasn't really had the opportunity to really form these tight, long-term bonds. And so in a sense, she's kind of isolated, right? She's kind of closed herself off a bit. And along the way, she meets a young man, Amber, who's kind of in the same situation where he's dreaming of freedom, knowing that part of the hustle, for lack of a better term, of slavery, of keeping these individuals kind of tied to their plantation or this place is this falsehood of allowing them to form connections and families. Where if you think of it, It's a completely natural thing that by the time you get into your teens, you start going through puberty, most will begin to develop romantic interest in other people. As you get older, it's a natural way of life. Those attractions become romantic. They might become sexual in nature. It's a natural part of life. And as a byproduct of that, as with everything else, is within nature is this thing of reproduction. With humans, at least, maybe a few other organisms, there's first this spark of interest. You meet someone, you get together, somewhere down the road, there's offspring. But in the case of human beings, quite often we form family groups. You form bonds, connect with other people. When you're born, you have a connection to your mother, you have a connection to your father, you have a connection to your more extended relatives. So that might be brothers and sisters, your aunts, uncles, cousins, grandparents. When you come of age and you're fortunate enough to meet someone and you guys form a connection that now becomes your girlfriend, your boyfriend, later your husband, wife, you guys now decide, okay, we're going to have a family, and you have children of your own. So you might have grandchildren. You meet people, you form friendships as well. You form connections with all of these people. You have relationships with them. But now imagine this very human thing to connect, to love, to be loved. Having those natural urges, that natural drive, but knowing from a very young age that your parents could be sold away. You could be sold away. Your grandparents could be taken and, sent to wherever. Your cousins, your brothers, your sisters, your family, these bonds that usually bind us together, given your lack of freedom, your lack of recognized personhood, that these bonds are tenuous at best. Because a failed crop, a slave master dying, a slave master being in debt could lead to a family member or multiple family members needing to be sold off. Or just like someone wanting a new dress or a new suit or a horse or something like that. And given the times and your lack of freedom, your lack of ability to move about or to easily communicate with other people, you might never see that person again. It's like, think of it that your mother, your father, your grandparent, whoever it is that you have in your life that you love, that you care about, this is your person. That today or tomorrow something can happen, and not just that they're removed from your life, not like they die or something like that. Someone can just come along and say, you know what, today I'm sending you from here to China for as much as it's concerned, because you're never going to see them again. This is someone that you've bonded with, someone that you love, because this is someone you've grown up with, you've spent time with. And someone else has the authority to just come along and say, you know what, you're out of here today. You're never seeing this person again. After experiencing that a few times, after seeing that a few times, you might not be inclined to continue forming relationships. And so Amber is dreaming of freedom and has to a degree put his life on hold. You have like the usual expectations, which is that he's now in his early 20s and he hasn't had like a serious girlfriend. He's not married, doesn't have any kids, because he recognizes the game. He recognizes the hustle of having him form these ties, which are really tenuous. They put him in a position of binding him to this place, right? Of binding him to other people. And with that, tying you to this place that keeps you in bondage. And so he has this fear that if he forms a relationship with a woman, gets married, settles down, has kids, it becomes something that can be taken away from him, where he would have to worry about his children or his wife being sold off. And not just that, not just the fear of having them be sold off, but also having a wife, children, loving them, and wanting to maintain this relationship with them. You'd be less inclined to run off, to leave them behind. And so with that, having a family might tie him to this place. And so he's decided to put those aspects of his life on hold. But in me and Liz, there's kind of a spark between them because they're pretty much two sides of the same coin. You also have this burgeoning thing of wisdom and all this ugliness, for lack of a better term, right? Trying to get freedom is this little kernel of a potential love story. And so with that, it's an incredibly beautiful book. But I don't want to give too much of the book away. So I'm not going to get too into the details of what occurs, because I think this is one of those books, unlike others, where we can discuss the overall themes, or I can give you an overall idea of the theme of the book, but I would spoil the book for you by telling you exactly what happens. This isn't one of those books where I can tell you what happens, you read it, and you still get the same level of enjoyment. So here are the things that I liked and disliked about the book. First of all, I decided to read this book because I think it's like a few years ago now. Maybe this was like back in 2020, 2021, I read Deacon King Kong, which is also by James McBride, and I actually really enjoyed that book. I reviewed it back then, and I added this book to my reading list with the intention of reading it. But I try as much as possible to kind of space out books from the same author, just to kind of like, spread the love around. I love both books, but they're actually quite different. I really enjoyed the level of detail, McBride's way of describing scenes. It's very descriptive to the point where you can easily envision it in your mind's eye. I've been to Maryland, but we're out in the wilderness or out in the water or anything like that. But through the author's descriptions, I can imagine these things in my mind. And so I like the descriptiveness of it, the way that he weaves the story together. It's a very action-packed book with a lot of twists and turns, and there's a lot of tension that makes it exciting to read. It's certainly a page-turner. I read this very quickly, so certainly there's that. Another thing that I really enjoyed was the use of this idea of the Underground Railroad Code. It's something that I actually find quite interesting. I like this kind of stuff, puzzles and riddles and secret phrases and seeing all that kind of stuff come together. To me, it's kind of like I like secret agent stuff, right? Like espionage and whatnot, where you have to know codes, you look for signals, signs, symbols, things like that. You kind of have to know who you can talk to, who you can't talk to, who's an ally, who's a foe, who might be like a double agent, who might double cross you. And so that adds some excitement to it. I also like the historical basis of the code. I remember back in 2020 when I went to Memphis, I visited this house that had been a stop on the Underground Railroad. So you go into the house with the tour guides, the information, and they share information about how signals would be used on the Underground Railroad. So it's this thing of, if you think of the history of quilting, where certain patterns and hanging a certain quilt or a certain rug out, turning the weather vane this way, putting a lamp out on the porch, not putting a lamp out, these little symbols would convey messages. And I find that fascinating. So it's a really important key in the book. And I thought it was just absolutely amazing, right? Now, the thing that I did not like, not so much the character Liz, but these future visions that she had. The reason being that it offers some commentary on the present day, but the whole vision and seeing the future thing, I thought it was kind of cheesy. Aside from that, I felt the rest of the book, even the whole concept of the dreamer and whatnot, I felt that was cool, but just the way it's executed with, the premonitions that she had, these future visions, it just wasn't doing it for me. That was the one thing that I didn't like in the book. She would drop into these visions and it's okay, here we go again. Let's just get through this. But otherwise, I thoroughly enjoyed this book and I highly recommend it. Thanks for tuning in. Show notes are available on the Noire website via the link in the episode description. If you enjoyed this episode and want more book recommendations, subscribe to the channel, click the notification bell, and check out my book review playlist.